morning. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the Latin American program here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event on religion and violence in Central America. We've heard multiple times over the last months and years that the Northern Triangle of Central America is the most violent place in the world outside of situations of outright shooting wars. But we have heard much less about the efforts to respond to gang violence by getting people out of gangs. And I think what is really unique about today's panelists is the amount of time that they have spent examining particularly faith-based efforts to get people to leave gangs in Central America. You have probably the bios in front of you, but because we have such a distinguished panel, I'd like to give you a few highlights. Our first speaker will be Robert Brenaman, who is a professor of sociology at St. Michael's College in Vermont. His research focuses on the impact of violence and violent social structures on human well-being, and most notably for today's discussion, he's the author of Homies and Hermanos, God and Gangs in Central America, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And he advises a team of Guatemalan researchers that are studying the impact of Pentecostal and charismatic movements on civic participation and social capital in Guatemala. Our next speaker will be John Walth, who is a visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Luther College in Iowa. He is the author of Jesus and the Gang, Youth Violence and Christianity in Urban Honduras, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2011. His research has focused on social capital development, interpersonal and social violence, religious belief, and drug consumption among children and youth. Our third speaker is a person who we are really delighted, along with other panels, but especially delighted to welcome Pastor Jose Alvarado to this panel. He was born in San Miguel, El Salvador. He migrated to escape the Civil War in 1986, ultimately coming to the D.C. area. While he was here, he found that there was a great demand in the Salvadoran community for food products from the region, and he therefore founded Rio Grande Foods, which has now become synonymous with not only quality but also social responsibility. Josue, I thought I knew where to get good pupusas, but now I'm going to make an extra effort to find a different kind. Josue founded the program Trabajamos por la Paz. We work for peace to rehabilitate and reincorporate ex-gang members. Trabajemos por la Paz is composed of church and business leaders who draw on their religious faith to teach life skills to former gang members based on the conviction that rehabilitation is much better than incarceration. Our next speaker, again, a pleasure to welcome back to the Wilson Center, a former public policy scholar here through a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation to work on issues of religion and politics. Tim Steigenga is professor of political science and chair of social sciences and humanities at the Wilkes Honors College of Florida Atlantic University. He's the author of many books on issues of migration, has worked in South Florida and with the county and local governments to look long-term over the migrant communities that have settled in Florida. He has spent months in Guatemala as a Fulbright scholar and is one of the people I think most knowledgeable about the lives of migrants here in the United States. And then finally, we will hear from Alex Wilde, a friend, colleague, and again, a pleasure to welcome you here. Alex is a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. He's a board member of the Latin American program, a former public policy scholar, and now, most relevant to this panel, he is the director of the program at American University at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies on religion and violence in Latin America. Alex spent many years at the Ford Foundation as the former director of the Washington Office on Latin America, has taught just about every place in the Midwest one would want to teach, and again, it's a pleasure to have you here. So I will ask the panelists to make opening presentations, and then we look forward to engaging in a dialogue with you. Jose Alvarado will be speaking in Spanish. There are headsets for those of you who might need them. So if you raise your hands, we can have people walk around during the opening presentation to give them to you. Okay. Thank you. Bob, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, both for the introduction and for bringing us here. This is a real pleasure to be here. I feel I'm a news scholar, so I feel a little bit like a little leaguer to be talking to such a distinguished audience of academics, and I'm told policymakers and people involved in people in Washington. Wow. But I really am excited to be here. I want to do my absolute best to reduce some of the ideas in my book, Homies and Hermanos, into about 15 minutes. I'm not sure how that's going to go, but I'm going to do my best. And I can't wait for the Q&A session afterwards. There is a crisis of gang violence in northern Central America. It's not the only crisis that northern Central America faces. And gangs are not the only source of violence in Central America. It's really important for me to say that from the outset. Nevertheless, for hundreds of thousands of Hondurans, Guatemalans, and Salvadorans living in marginal communities of cities throughout the Northern Triangle, gang violence is an everyday reality, is something that they have to negotiate, they have to be thinking about, and they do think about it every day. So it's no surprise then that gang youth are among some of the most despised individuals in their nations and in their communities, not just because of what they've done, but also because of how they have been scapegoated in many cases for sort of held to blame for all of the violence in their countries. A poll done in 2007 when I was doing my research in Guatemala showed that when asked about the various measures to deal with gang violence, 60% of Guatemalans polled in a representative sample cited support for social cleansing as one way of dealing with gang violence. That is extrajudicial killings, and we thought we were out of that era of dirty violence, of dirty war in Central America. Nevertheless, there's widespread support because of the exasperation, the frustration, and I would say probably because of some of the racial and class animosity toward gang members. There is strong support for social cleansing just of gang members as a way of dealing with gang violence, the way of reducing it, get rid of the gang members. Just a quick example, my father-in-law, my in-laws live in a small working class neighborhood of Zone 8 in Guatemala City, and a couple of years ago my father-in-law was approached by one of the other middle class members of that working class neighborhood to see if he would give his donation toward eliminating a local gang member who was causing a lot of trouble in the neighborhood. This was a respectable doctor, in this case, that approached him. Some of the doctors and lawyers and other professionals in the community were at their wits' end about what to do about this particular young man who was stealing and extorting the stores in the neighborhood, and they had gone to police and hadn't been able to do anything. And so my father-in-law was approached to make a contribution. He declined, but the extermination went forward, and very soon after that, the young man was eliminated. This is the kind of hatred and animosity that exists towards ex-gang members in Central America. And it's reaching all the way to the United States, by the way. That negative stigma of gang members in the paper today, in the Wall Street Journal today, there's a cover photo about a story reporting that the U.S. immigration process officials are now denying visas or denying green cards to some individuals who have gangs that who have tattoos that make them suspicious for gang activity. This is a new kind of thing in the WSJ is now reporting on it. I think it's interesting that it reaches all the way to the U.S. So against this backdrop of widespread anger and resentment towards gang members, the evangelical Pentecostal claim that Jesus can save anyone takes on a special, even political significance. And it's not just Pentecostals, but also gang members. Some gang members and gang leaders believe this. And so in my book, I talk about the evangelical exemption. So within the gang, since the early 2000s, it has been widely said to be the case that the only way out of the gang is hasta la muerte. The gang is a lifelong commitment, and the only way to get out is through death. Now, that's only partially true. That's kind of an overstatement, but it's in some ways a threat. It's both a cry of solidarity and a threat. Hasta la morgue. We're in this all the way to the end, and when you're interested in leaving, remember, hasta la morgue. The only way out of here is in your pine box suit, and tu tacuche de madera is the way it's sometimes put. Nevertheless, if you join an evangelical congregation, a lot of gang leaders, cell leaders, will provide a kind of exception for you. As long as you demonstrate that it's a true conversion. Many community members in the neighborhood also accept this evangelical exemption, that an ex-gang member is to be feared and hated and watched. If he joins an evangelical congregation, then perhaps we can trust him again. Pentecostals believe further that Jesus wants to save especially the worst and wants us, that is, believers, to play a role in that conversion process. So they're active in this, in going after gang members to try to get them to leave. In other words, for Pentecostals, gang violence is considered a spiritual problem. Mm-hmm. Now, when they say this is a spiritual problem, they're not washing their hands of the problem. They're bringing it into the realm of their own capacity in terms of the gang, the Pentecostal ministers and gang ministry coordinators who use this terminology of this is a spiritual problem. They were not washing their hands of it. They were saying this is our problem, and we have means to deal with it. But talk is cheap to a certain extent. Theology isn't everything. So Pentecostals believe this. But what do they actually do in terms of gang ministry? What resources do they have? Well, my book explores several social resources that Pentecostal churches who engage in gang ministry have. Among them, tight community bonds that in some ways resemble the kind of tight, dense social networks of the gang that a gang member is leaving if he chooses to leave the gang. Clear boundaries identifying who is in and out. A strong sense of family. We call each other hermanos. In the gang, they often call each other mano. So it's not entirely unfamiliar territory. Pentecostal churches have social capital for getting a job, maybe not the best job in the world, certainly not the high jobs that ex-gang members wouldn't have the credentials to get anyway, but a job, something that pays the bills. And furthermore, and this is something I explore in more depth in my book, emotional embodied rituals of worship and confession that signal to the community and to the ex-gang member himself that something important is afoot here. I am not just manufacturing this change because something came over me at that service and I began to sweat. I began to get hot all over and I began to tremble and I began to weep in public, and I would never do that if I could control it myself. Therefore, this comes from somewhere else. This is not my own doing. That's a powerful clue to the self. That I am not, this is beyond me. Something big is afoot here. It's a clue to the self. It's a clue to the community. That's a very important capacity that Pentecostal churches have in their confession rituals. Rituals are really important. I'm a Durkheimian, so I think this stuff matters a lot, not just what we say, not just our institutions. And finally, Pentecostals have a means for verifying the authenticity of the conversion claim, and that is because Pentecostals, certainly barrio Pentecostals in Central America, have high standards for living, standards for what you can and can't participate in anymore as a young man, especially for men. And these weigh heavily on new converts who leave the gang. And so this provides both the community and the former gang cell a way of judging whether this conversion is serious or not, because the stakes are high. But this is a policy-oriented community, I've been told, a crowd. So the question is, does it work? Does Pentecostal gang ministry actually work? And I would argue that it depends on how you state the question. I am firmly convinced, as a sociologist, that Pentecostal churches provide some of the best available exit communities and recovery programs for gang members wishing to leave. They provide some of the most functional, most successful exit strategies and communities that exist, that are widely available in Central America. Now, don't get me wrong, not all Pentecostal churches go to the trouble of gang ministry. Certainly there are some. Certainly I encountered stories from ex-gang members of being rejected in Pentecostal communities. But by and large, Pentecostal churches really, if they are living up to their claim that Jesus wants to save everyone, especially the worst of sinners, gang members provide the perfect candidates for evangelization. It's not easy, and many Pentecostal ministers who engage in this kind of ministry are upfront about saying it's not easy, it takes a long time, sometimes it doesn't work that well, but we are committed to doing this because this is who we are. And I would also argue that not all Pentecostal gang ministries are alike. They're not all created equal. Some Pentecostal gang ministry coordinators and pastors have done a better job of learning from their experience, learning from past mistakes than others. So they're not all exactly the same. I have such little time that I can't go into all those differences, but I want to make that, point that out. But if the question is Pentecostalism the answer to gang violence in Central America? No way. It is not a panacea for gang violence in Central America, don't get me wrong. For an individual who is faced with very few opportunities, very few possibilities for leaving the gang, it is probably, Pentecostal gang ministries offer the best possible exit strategy and exit means that exists, but that doesn't mean that Pentecostalism and Pentecostal gang ministry is what the doctor ordered for gang violence in Central America, in part because I found evidence that some of the youth who joined gangs had actually grown up in Pentecostal communities themselves. So they were not completely, the Pentecostal church is not completely successful at keeping youth out of the gang, but it is fairly successful as a community of refuge, as my colleague Walth will talk about, for those who need it. Nevertheless, it's hugely important that realistic exit pathways be available in Central America. Why? Because experienced gang members are a huge liability in their communities, whether or not they're still active in the gang. Because one of the biggest problems, and even gang cell leaders will tell you this, one of the biggest problems is that experienced gang members have valuable skills and assets. They know where to get the drugs. They know how to sell them well. They know how to extort. They have, in a sense, that negative social capital of being able to go and knock on a store window and get a payment like this. And if I can do that for myself, why would I continue to pass up the money to the gang? Why not just keep it for myself? And so this is the big temptation of freelancing, continuing. So it's really important to provide pathways to leaving the gang, realistic pathways to leaving the gang for experienced gang members who often get tired of it. Me aburrí, which doesn't mean the same thing as I got bored of the gang. It means more like I got sick and tired of the gang, is the way I interpret it, or worn out by the gang. That's very common among experienced gang members. So it is important that these things exist. What should U.S. policymakers do about this? I mean, what if, from a practical standpoint, what's to be done? If the question is what's to be done about gang violence, not just how to get individual gang members out. We know that there's some Pentecostal strategies that work, but what about gang violence in general? If I'm pushed on putting forth the policy strategies. I would have to say some of the most important things we can do is to encourage lawmakers to resist the temptation to adopt confrontational, punitive strategies for dealing with gang violence. These measures tend to simply up the ante and create a warrior mentality, a war mentality between the youth of the neighborhood and local police. And that seems to have been, in part, what led to the sort of increasing of the morgue rule or the morgue penalty for leaving the gang. Also, I think the El Salvador case shows us clearly that it's not possible to incarcerate your way out of the gang or to arrest your way out of the gang. El Salvador really took in the mid-2000s an approach of arresting thousands, tens of thousands of youth suspected of belonging to a gang. Many of those were sort of treated in a catch-and-release format. Those who were imprisoned often became more sophisticated in their violence and in their networks and their knowledge within the prison system. So incarcerating your way out is not a good approach. We need to, in a sense, encourage lawmakers in Central America to resist those temptations, even though they play well in the media. They really do, because of the exasperation, the tiredness of violence. We need to support increased spending on public security. We really do. It's a classic example, Guatemala. In Guatemala, there are 5 private security officers for every single police officer, that is, member of the national police, which is the only police force in the country. 5 to 1. That means that security is a private good, largely, in Central America. So if you live in a gated community, in a gated middle-class community, you can have a relative sense of safety when you're at home, some semblance of safety. If you live in a marginalized community that doesn't have gates and doesn't hire a private security firm to do policing in that area, you simply don't get security. And I think security is a public good. That doesn't mean throwing, money will solve everything, but good policing can make a difference. And not just policing, but improving the justice system, the public justice system, so that more than 6% of murders result in a conviction. Right now in Guatemala, again, I'm using Guatemala as an example, only 6% of murders result in a conviction, which led the UN special rapporteur, to the conclusion that Guatemala is a good place to commit murder, because you can be pretty sure that you'll get away with it. And gang murders never get investigated. I can tell you this because at least one of the ex-gang members I interviewed was killed 6 weeks after I interviewed him. He was a fairly high-profile, well-known gang member, had been on ex-gang member. X is important, had been on national television and everything. If his murder was not investigated, none of the rest of the gang members are going to be investigated. Gang murders, police will tell you, are not worth our time. We have limited resources. We're not going to waste our time with those. So if we want to deal with gang violence, that's one way to do it. Social cleansing, the people engaged in that have kind of a free blank check to do that. And when appropriate, in limited ways, I think we could and should make funding available for Pentecostal ministers already engaged to build their own capacity by learning from each other about best practices. Now, we shouldn't go in and just kind of find Pentecostal gang ministries and fund them and sort of try to multiply them everywhere because, hey, if it works, more money can expand it and everything. I don't think that's a good idea necessarily. But encouraging, helping Pentecostals involved in this kind of ministry to build their own capacity, to learn from their own best practices and to learn from others is a good idea, I think. USAID has done some funding in this, and certainly in Guatemala. Some of it has gone better than others. I have some colleagues who think it's a really bad idea. I don't share that view. I think done well, it's not the worst place in the world to put your money. I'm not as concerned about the religion and state kind of a wall there as I would be elsewhere, perhaps. but it's that's one way. My dream is that gang ministry might provide a pathway to political consciousness and an impetus for organizing around a social cause for Pentecostals and Pentecostal ministers in Central America, most of whom don't have formal training in social structures, in sociology and anthropology. But I think this could be a kind of consciousness-raising moment, event, an organizing moment. It's a big dream, kind of, but stranger things have happened. Perhaps human rights work is a new frontier for Pentecostal churches, rooted in the conviction that social cleansing eliminates the potential for God to show God's power by converting the worst of sinners. And so Pentecostals may be, in a sense, the kind of the potential human rights workers of the next generation. That's my hope. That's what I write about, and those are my comments. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you very much. John.
Again, I want to thank Cynthia for putting together the panel and inviting us here to the Wilson Center. I'm an anthropologist, and my particular variety of anthropology believes in being really close to the ground. I'm an ethnographer, and I look at particular cases in particular communities. And I was a little daunted and overcome with trying to think of how to scale up what I've discovered at a very local place to larger implications. So I'm going to try to sort of move back and forth between what we can generalize out of a particular location at a particular point in time. As Robert said, there is a crisis of gang violence in the Northern Triangle, and we sometimes use this terminology of crisis as sort of a catchphrase, right, to get us all alarmed. And I would like us to sort of pull back for a moment and think that perhaps the crisis is not the gang violence itself. Perhaps gang violence is more of a symptom of something else that's going on. And that the real root of crisis here is a crisis of community. And what we are seeing is a systematic disentanglement of former structures, social structures, in the light of increases in foreign intervention, increases in globalization, an increase in poverty, a disinvestment in human development in the region. So I'd like to focus primarily on talking about what I mean in terms of a crisis in community from the perspective of a particular working poor neighborhood in Honduras. I did my work in El Progreso, which is remarkable for no particular reason whatsoever, other than the fact that most research in urban Latin America tends to focus on large settlements, and El Progreso is a mid-sized city, 90,000. And because of this, it faces a series of issues and dilemmas, particularly in terms of governmental and non-governmental resources that other places like San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa don't face. And I think that's crucial, that when aid arrives, when government intervention happens, it happens in a very piecemeal fashion, and it tends to focus primarily on the places of the larger centers of population, or conversely, in the very rural areas, and there's a big difference between the way that rural poverty and urban poverty manifests. I had a long conversation about 3/4 of the way through my field work with the lay leader of the Catholic community that I worked in. Chago had grown up in the Catholic Church. He'd come back and become a respected youth leader, and we had a lot in common at that time. I was in my mid-20s, he was in his mid-20s, and he had come back after living away from El Progreso and moved in to help care for his ailing mother, and took over this position as a youth group leader. And he encapsulated for me really what was going on at many places in urban neighborhoods in Honduras in a particular phrase that has stuck with me. He told me, he said, "John, a cada uno reza por su santo," which means everyone prays to their own saint. It's a way of expressing that there is no sense of solidarity at the community level. And this got me to think particularly at the different kinds of tensions that exist that are leading towards each individual doing their own thing or looking after their own needs and not necessarily the needs of others in their community. So again, I want to stress that the main problem for human development at the most local level in urban Honduras is how to increase a sense of community that will provide support for all of its members. And this means finding a way to include all local social institutions in on a dialogue about what it means to be a part of a particular neighborhood or a particular city. In other words, how do you change the current cultural practice to be more inclusive, to create cooperation? Catholic and evangelical churches can play a crucial role in creating networks of support for local communities, partly because they're the primary institutions for many Hondurans, especially the working poor. Again, El Progreso doesn't have a large presence of NGOs. They don't feel the flow of development dollars in the same way as, say, San Pedro Sula or Tegucigalpa. At the level of the barrio, at the level of the colonia, there are very few institutions that are working with these populations. Those that are in many ways very grassroots. They're community-based organizations. They include evangelical church ministries. They include the Catholic Church and local Catholic ministries. And I would make the case that gangs, too, are a community-based organization. They are a CBO. They have a vital role to play in the shaping of the community that they're a part of. While what a gang does, right, the gun and drug trafficking, the promotion of violent retaliation, theft, extortion, etc., all of this is antithetical to human development. I agree. But what a gang is, a network of support, a response to conditions of material and social uncertainty, this is rooted in a concern for developing one's material and social well-being, even if it at a great individual and social cost. We need to reframe the way that we think about gangs to see that they are as integral a part of what's going on at the local level as other community-based organizations. Our tendency is not to want to collaborate, right? Our tendency is to demonize. And any response to increasing the betterment of the lives of poor urban folks in Honduras and elsewhere is going to require a large-scale or a concerted effort, I should say, at working and cooperation at the level of the barrio. As I'd mentioned, Catholic churches, evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and gang cells are all the primary social institution or social institutions for working poor communities. They form a social structure that provides a way of providing symbolic and material resources for its members, and a set of norms for interacting with others, both within their own communities and between different communities within the neighborhood. They help guide members through social life. And in essence, the relationships between these various social institutions provide the undergirding of what it means to be a part of a community. Part of what's going on in urban Central America is that older social institutions for adolescents and youth in particular are on the decline, or they no longer exerting the same type of presence that they had in the past. We can see this in terms of the disintegration of extended kin networks through migration. We can see this through the fact that many adolescents and youth are not part of the school system, either through electing to not stay in school or through not being allowed to go to school, or because of costs. And so, again, who's picking up the slack in these communities tend to be oftentimes churches and, to some extent, gangs. We can see then that as social institutions, gangs and churches exist in a kind of tension with one another. There is a certain level of distrust and antagonism between all three. And I think that's key. And this is partly what's pointing to this crisis of community, is that the Catholic Church, Pentecostal churches, and evangelical churches, and gangs don't really want to they don't know how to interact with one another in a way that creates a sense of belonging at the level of the barrio. Partly because they are competing in many ways for the same members, right? You have evangelical churches who are proselytizing for members, particularly targeting adolescents and youth. The Catholic Church, and at the level of the parish, is in many places in the communities that I visited have a waning influence. And finally, gangs themselves need members to perpetuate their existence. And so they're providing a vision of what it means to be a part of a particular community. What can we do for you, right? And is sort of the message that each of these institutions are trying to give. If we compare the three briefly, we can see that there is, as Robert had pointed out, there is almost a détente between evangelical ministries and gangs, right? They see each other as providing a certain kind of service, if you will, in which it is widely known throughout the region that if you are a gang member and you are tired of being a gang member, one potential to leave the gang is through conversion, but it has to be conversion of a particular kind. It has to be a conversion to an evangelical or Pentecostal church. Catholicism, for a variety of reasons, will not do it. You have to, it is a form of escape or from the gang, or a safety valve, if you will, that works primarily at the local level. It requires a complete transformation of one's corporeal being, their stance, the language that they use, the clothing that they wear. And it requires a learning of specialized knowledge. You have to be able to quote scripture. You have to be able to preach. In many ways, what it takes to be a good gang member, the charisma, is what it takes to be a good youth minister, the charisma. You're abandoning a certain amount of fear to go out and talk to others about what it is you're doing. Both evangelical churches and gangs see themselves as being exclusionary, right? They require a certain amount of special accoutrements that are needed to demonstrate your membership. And that level of exclusion sets themselves apart from the wider community, especially with evangelical and Pentecostal churches. They don't want to be associated with the world at large, because the world at large is sinful, and they see themselves as being separating themselves from the traditional sinful, as they call it, behavior of the barrio: drinking, dancing, cavorting, spending time on street corners, womanizing. Whereas, I'll just say this briefly, the Catholic Church sees themselves as being the community. Historically, they have been they have identified themselves with the poorest of the poor, especially since the rise of liberation theology in the region and basic ecclesiastical communities. They see themselves as being the identifying with, in solidarity with all of a community, those two are at odds, right? If you see yourself as being at once part of the community or being in solidarity with the community, how can you exclude gang members who are themselves also part of the community, right? But evangelical churches allow gang members to say, wait, we've left all that sinful behavior that we used to do behind. And so those three institutions exist in such a way that they preclude right now any sort of cooperation, concerted cooperation between the three. And I think it's the challenge of the development community, people who are interested in human development in particular, to find a way to get these people, these organizations, these institutions at the local level. I'm not talking at the hierarchical level, at the local level, in conversation with one another.
I'd like to also take a moment to recognize Adam Stubbits, Program Associate with the Latin American Program, who's been a tremendous help in putting together this program, as well as our hardworking interns, Katie and Julie. I'm not sure, I don't think Melissa's here, but anyway, thank you. Adam's going to help with a short video that Jose will use to preface his presentation.
Rio Grande Foods is a Salvadoran company founded in 1992, dedicated to the production, exportation, and distribution of nostalgic foods, where today reaches 22 states in the American Union and Canada. Rio Grande not only stands out for its quality of products, but also for the commitment to its employees and Salvadoran society. We are concerned about its highest levels of crime that suffer El Salvador and the disintegration of values and principles that hit the Salvadoran youth. That's why Rio Grande creates the project Work for Peace. The main goal is to generate areas of opportunities and the insertion of those young people that are in risk of violence through the creation of companies and jobs for them. This project supports Christian churches so they can work with the youth at risk in the high crime communities. We set tutors that develop the program with each of them. The entire program is supported and certified by the Christian Fellowship Intercontinental as a social committed company. Our goals are reached through three areas of work: prevention, rehabilitation, and the insertion of the young to the communities. In the area of prevention, we organize sports activity for recreation, development of discipline, and fight leisure time. Prevention campaigns with inspirational messages, principles and values transmitted through art. Training of religious leaders from the community, giving them advices on how to prevent violence. Medical brigades from different institutions to improve the quality of life that these young boys and girls have. In the area of rehabilitation, we give them programs that allows them to have the opportunity to get out from the gangs and take a second chance in life through an emotional and spiritual transformation. This program brings spiritual and psychological help from the spiritual leaders that live and work with them in the high crime communities. We train their tutors and spiritual leaders. We give them spiritual retreats that push the transformation of these young. The program allows these young to return with positive actions all the damage that they did, identify the attitudes to develop trainings for the young in order to find a job, tattoo removal for a better appearance and increase their self-esteem.
Hemos recibido un trato muy bonito en cual pues nos han llevado a retiros, actividades en las cuales yo me he sentido bien, me he sentido una persona importante, cosa que una vez en la cárcel no sentí. Fue cuando un policía estando en la cárcel me puso la bota en mi cara y él me dijo a mí que yo no valía nada, que era una persona que nada más era un código, era un número en la sociedad. Me hizo sentir mal, eso ha marcado mi vida, esas palabras que me dijo ese policía en esa ocasión. Cosas que Dios me ha hecho cambiar de mi mente, porque ahora para mí soy un hijo de Dios, una persona muy importante para
The
Él.
last part of our goal is to reinsert the young to the society by providing jobs inside the communities to prevent any fights with their rival gang, develop different type of craft and occupational workshops which allow them to bring the daily support to their homes.
Este es un lugar en el cual uno puede experimentar nuevas cosas positivas en la vida de uno, ¿verdad? Que nosotros hemos aprendido aquí a llevarnos como amigos, no para hacer lo malo, sino hacer algo productivo, ¿verdad? Y esta panadería de Trabajemos por la Paz, desde que nosotros empezamos en este proyecto, gracias a Dios nos ha bendecido, nos sentimos bien. Yo en lo personal me siento bien, ¿verdad? Porque es una oportunidad que se me abre a mí, ¿verdad? El poder aprender, el poder elaborar lo que es el pan, es algo que Dios ha dejado, ¿verdad? Y una bendición grande, pues, el poder estar, ser parte de este programa, ser parte de este proyecto.
When the rehab process is finished, the young are ready to work outside of their communities. We develop socialization activities such as psychological tests, creating a resume, teamwork training, and life skills. All these in order to make these young eligible employees and place them in a formal company. Rio Grande, to the date, has its program in 13 conflict communities of El Salvador, and over 250 young in the program, and has social and labor reinserted more than 150 young. On the other hand, one of the companies engaged with this problem and shares the same vision of our country is League of Central America, a company that manufactures and produces sport clothing for over 2,000 universities of the United States. In this company, the 20% of the workforce are young people and have former gang members. It also possesses monitoring programs for the potential development of young people in the company. League, along with Rio Grande Foods, have developed a whole methodology for approach to the problem of gangs and mobs with base of a 3-year experience working with young former gang members, which leads to develop along the Vice Ministry of Justice and Public Security the Special Parks of Work and Insertion and Peace Culture, which was filled on the 20th this year.
Pero obviamente dentro del sistema falta construir hacia dónde iban los privados de libertad cuando salían de la cárcel. Pero aún más complicado estaba el asunto en razón de lo que este par de amigos del empresariado habían estado trabajando desde hace 3 años, y era el hecho de frontalmente, valientemente introducirse al área de contratar o generar empleo, a algo que ha sido descuidado lamentablemente por todos los gobiernos de este país. Es el hecho de los pandilleros, que obviamente hay que resolver esta situación de abandono y que es necesario para poder cortar el ciclo de violencia que el país ha
This
tenido.
proposal was presented to the President of the Republic and built in a package of measures for the prevention and reduction of violence. Actions and measures that are within the framework of a national security agreement promoted by the President. The road to a better future for peace is drawn.
El otro eje que hemos planteado y del cual ya el propio viceministro también ha hecho un anticipo es lo que hemos llamado los parques especiales de inserción laboral y cultura de paz. En términos generales, ¿de qué se trata? De identificar a jóvenes que habitan en territorios con alta presencia de pandillas y asentamientos urbanos precarios para luego formarlos, brindarles capacitación que les lleve a lograr certificaciones técnicas que respondan a las demandas del mercado laboral. Aquí, entre otros actores, serán las mismas empresas las que colaborarían en la capacitación de estos jóvenes en un esfuerzo por acercar a la empresa privada a esta población. Esta experiencia de Río Grande y de otra empresa más, la empresa LIC, que también es una empresa de capital extranjero, serían como los paradigmas a seguir, porque ya ellos vienen iniciando esto desde hace meses atrás y ya nos pueden dar la pauta de cómo es que hay que proceder en este caso. Aquí pretendemos invertir inicialmente $2,5 millones y participarían en un primer momento un grupo de jóvenes que no sobrepasaría los 1000 jóvenes. Nos moveríamos de un rango entre 500, 600 hasta 1000 jóvenes, dependiendo también de la cantidad de empresas que se vean involucradas en este esfuerzo.
It's in our hands to support this initiative that seeks to boost El Salvador to a new era of hope. A new El Salvador where our children can grow in a climate of security and opportunities. Be part of this transformation. El Salvador needs you.
Fraternidad Cristiana Intercontinental en San Miguel te invita a sus diferentes celebraciones. Domingos 9:30 de la mañana, martes 6:30 de la tarde, viernes y sábados.
Bueno, gracias. Bueno, Josué, por favor.
Gracias, Cintia. Gracias, muy buenos días. Me siento emocionado poder estar en este lugar, en esta actividad, para poder, ustedes han visto en este video algunas realidades que vive nuestro país. Yo como salvadoreño que salí y en medio de una guerra, definitivamente expuesto a morir 2 veces, en una oportunidad murió una persona que era el que manejaba en ese día que yo tenía que estar. Después, en otra oportunidad por confusión, que habían dado la orden en el tiempo de la guerra que a mí me mataran, y murió esa persona porque identificaron quién era y murió ese día. Con todo eso yo salgo para este país, vengo de un hogar cristiano, mi padre Jose Alvarado, 60 años de servicio de pastor, y la educación que nos dio en los principios bíblicos, y eso formó nuestra vida, mi carácter y mi persona. Vengo a este país y empiezo definitivamente de cero. Yo allá tenía mi pequeña empresa de fabricar queso y todo eso, pero vengo y con las dificultades de idioma, de espacios y todo, empiezo a tocar puertas en apartamento a apartamento, creando ahí la necesidad o la demanda que había de los productos, y ahí nace Río Grande. Bueno, pasan los años y Río Grande, gracias a Dios, la comunidad salvadoreña y todos los latinoamericanos han hecho de Río Grande que esté en todos los mercados del área. Pero en eso estamos volviendo a El Salvador, ya se incluye una empresa ya que manufactura nuestros productos, de parte de la misma de Río Grande, y nos movemos en el ámbito con los pastores, estando en oriente del país, en una reunión de pastores. Estábamos ahí cuando le llevan el mensaje a un pastor, le han secuestrado, le llevaron a un miembro, a un joven de la iglesia, y ese joven, teníamos el retiro era de 3 días en un hotel, y le dicen, mire, están pidiendo tanto, y son los pandilleros que se lo han llevado. Cuando eso viene y le estaban dando mensajes, le van a quitar una mano porque no lo entregan y esto. Bueno, el punto es que a los 3, 4 días le dicen, él ya murió, está muerto. En una crisis como esa, en medio de eso, digo yo, pero ¿qué tenemos que hacer? Algo tenemos que hacer los cristianos, porque el problema en El Salvador, de alguna forma, ya se ha inmunizado. La iglesia misma no cree lo posible que puede ser rescatar a estos jóvenes. Yo quiero decirle, y estoy aquí para decirles que sí es posible. Cuando empezamos nosotros a hablar de Trabajemos por la Paz, tratamos de concientizar a empresarios, a pastores o a religiosos de que sí era posible haber una oportunidad para estos muchachos, pero definitivamente, y yo entiendo, no pudieron apoyar o sumarse al proyecto porque ellos mismos están siendo extorsionados quizás día a día, amenazados, o algún pariente ha fallecido de ellos. Y lo entendimos así, pero nosotros no paramos y seguimos y dijimos, esto tiene que haber verse visto, algo que lo hagamos y que vea un resultado positivo en la vida de cada uno de estos jóvenes. Y es así que continuamos. Quiero decirle que hay un equipo de trabajo Trabajemos por la Paz en El Salvador a tiempo completo, pagado, y cuando viene el tiempo de planilla me dice, esto ya, mire, le digo, Dios proveerá, y a pura fe, vamos, y esa gente no ha parado por 2 años y medio para 3 de estar haciendo la labor, lo cual ahora en este momento ya hay 250 jóvenes que han salido de delinquir y que muchos de ellos se han reinsertado ya primeramente en la iglesia y segundo en los trabajos. Y cuando tratamos, y a mí me toca cada inauguración ir a esos lugares, yo quiero decirle que me lleno más de energía, más fuerza cuando veo jovencitos de 11, 12, 13 años que por alguna razón solamente que han estado solos y quieren un compañerismo, un cariño, un espacio para ellos y se acercan a un grupo de pandilla y con la entrada les dicen, vení, somos tus hermanos, tus amigos y le dan una acogida. Pero cuando ya están ahí, lo primero que hacen es darle un revólver para que vaya a matar a 1, 2 y 3 y ya es el sello que definitivamente él no se puede salir. Cuando nosotros llegamos a tratar y hablar con ellos, vemos el deseo de salir porque saben que su espacio de vida es corto. Ellos viven hoy, no saben si mañana viven. Algo más que me llamaba la atención, cuántas madres y madres solteras que tienen sus hijos en sectores de conflicto, pero que no pueden porque no pueden moverse de ese lugar. Sus hijos bien dejan de ir a la escuela o si no van a trabajar. Si van a la escuela corren el riesgo de ser enrolados en la pandilla. Si van al trabajo están expuestos y digo yo, qué triste esta gente haber nacido en ese lugar para que esté en esta situación. Y es ahí donde toma fuerza y le digo, vamos a ir adelante, le digo al equipo, y ya son 2 años y medio y la preocupación que teníamos incluso para este año era que queríamos sacar 1000 muchachos de esos, pero la preocupación no podemos con pequeñas panaderías o talleres darles trabajo porque ya 1000 ya no los podemos emplear. En nuestra empresa tenemos gente de ella y esta empresa Lee que también está tomándolo gente, pero el volumen es mayor y le digo yo, aquí tiene que pasar algo y fue cuando llega el anuncio pues del gobierno de crear los parques especiales que para nosotros vemos una tremenda oportunidad en esto. Yo quiero decirle en alguno de los entrevistados, cuando llenan la nota y le preguntamos, ¿por qué quieres dejar la pandilla? Y uno de ellos nos dice, yo quiero dejarla porque mi papá era un traficante, dijo. Yo soy un pandillero extorsionista. Mi hijo de 1 año y medio no quiero que siga mi historia y por eso quiero dejar la pandilla. Y entonces son todas esas razones que nos mueven y nos hacen desprendernos, quizás con otras necesidades económicas nuestras, pero vemos la necesidad en el fenómeno que golpea a nuestros países en Latinoamérica y especialmente en Centroamérica. Es importante que yo menciono con poco, quiero decirle, porque no es mucho la inversión para lo que hemos hecho. Hacíamos un recuento que sacar un pandillero, ¿qué significa? La vida de él que se ha salvado, la vida de su familia que pudo haber muerto y cuántos él pudo haber matado. Ese es número que son 250, 300 que hemos sacado, 250 ya insertados y todo, y 300 con los otros que están recién llegados, esos ya fueran cuántos hubieran matado o cuántos de ellos hubieran muerto. Esas son las situaciones que definitivamente nosotros queremos hacer eco donde sea, llevar el mensaje que es posible transformar la vida de esos muchachos. Cuando alguien me dice, pero es imposible, a mí cuando empezamos esto, la mayoría, e incluso algunos hasta cristianos, me dice, esos no tienen remedio, que los maten a todos o que los metan a la cárcel a todos. Imposible hacer eso, son demasiados. Y es ahí donde ya ahora los medios pueden hablar de esto en El Salvador, es ahí donde ya tomó otro nivel y yo estoy seguro y confiado que definitivamente más organizaciones, más empresas se sumarán a este proyecto, porque yo quiero mencionarle, y tiene toda la razón cuando alguien me dice, pero si esos son peor que una bestia, que un animal, y tienen razón, porque yo puedo entender, y los que entienden lo espiritual entienden, ellos tienen una posesión dentro de ellos negativa, demoníaca en su vida, que hace que maten, que destruyan, que hagan todo, y que después que han matado al joven, se queden riendo. Pero cuando ya vemos la transformación por medio del poder de Dios en sus vidas, podemos ver tangible que pasan de ser un hombre destructor, un animal, a ser un suave jovencito disponible, y que en este momento quiero decirle que las empresas donde están laborando dan resultados que dan el 15% más de producción que la gente normal que tenemos en las empresas. ¿Qué quiere decir eso? Porque no han tenido una oportunidad de trabajo. De 10 años, 11 años, solo conocieron a los compañeros de pandilla y no saben y no han tenido una oportunidad. Pero esa oportunidad, si venimos y se lo damos, quiero decirle que cuando yo una de estas inauguraciones de los proyectos que se vieron, me llenó de emoción cuando me dice el líder del grupo, de la pandilla, ya como 24 de ellos, me dice: pasen adelante a todo el equipo de Trabajo por la Paz y usted, y empiezan y los ponen al centro y dicen a orar por protección por nosotros. Yo me quebranté cómo estos que destruían y mataban han sido transformados y han logrado y entender que ahora son hombres de bien, que pueden ser bien a la sociedad y que pueden aportar en su trabajo ya ahora que están empleados. Así es que yo mi mensaje, y yo lo que quiero decirle es que con poco se ha hecho mucho. Si somos más los que los sumamos para combatir este flagelo que tiene Latinoamérica, yo sé que los resultados se pueden ver y son posibles de verlo, porque yo lo he vivido. 250, 300 ya que están en 50 más que están en el proceso y 250 que han salido, dan muestra ahora que tienen una familia, tienen un hogar y que tienen su casita y que son productivos en las empresas y en las iglesias son activos. Así es que yo les agradezco definitivamente este foro para poder presentarles lo que es Trabajemos por la Paz, y esperando que Dios pueda tocar a más empresas, más gente que crea, porque ya le digo, cuando me dicen a mí: ¿tú qué necesidad tenés de irte a meter allá? Porque vamos a los lugares de conflicto. Cuando yo llego solo vamos y oramos y todo, y nos vamos a meter, y dice: pero tú te metiste ahí, porque es terrible, ahí ni la policía se acerca, porque eso es terrible. Pero usted viera que ahora que esos sectores que estaban de muerte, había muerte por 5 o 6 por semana en esas colonias, ahora dice apenas uno, me están diciendo ellos, se ha reducido la violencia y la muerte, y la gente en la calle con otro estilo de vida, porque se ha llegado a hacer un bien en ese lugar, y es posible hacerlo en Centroamérica y Latinoamérica. Yo les agradezco esta oportunidad, pero definitivamente espero y yo estoy creyendo que definitivamente lo que se necesitaba era hacer ver que es posible la transformación de estos jóvenes, para que el gobierno y organizaciones internacionales le puedan poner atención, porque a nosotros nos decían solamente puede haber fondos para prevención a los niños. Quiero decirle que la mejor prevención que podemos hacer en esos casos de esos hogares es sacando al padre, porque le decía, si él va a la cárcel y le tiran cadena perpetua, 100% su hijo va a ser un pandillero que sigue como líder a su padre. Pero la otra, si lo matan al pandillero, 100% por venganza, ese jovencito, ese niño va a ser un pandillero. Pero cuando logramos que ese de pandilla salga y que él mismo haga el trabajo con su hijo y le diga que es bueno ser una persona útil de la sociedad, yo sé que él hace el trabajo con sus hijos, con su familia, ya que todos están envueltos en el problema. Y eso es lo que hemos visto nosotros y los resultados que estamos teniendo. Les agradezco y gracias. Dios me los bendiga.
All right, thanks. Thank you. The last time I gave a talk here at Wilson, I realized only afterwards when I watched the webcast that my mic wasn't on. So, but you did ask me back, so thanks, Cindy. Didn't know if you were sending me a message. Thank you for the invitation. And I've had the privilege of reading John and Bob's books, and now hearing from Jose Alvarado. And I only wish I had been as accomplished a writer when I was writing my dissertation as these two gentlemen are. I recommend the books. They're excellent. I wish we had copies of them here, but you can find them on Amazon. So I'm going to focus my talk on some of the insights I picked up from the books, as well as the presentations today, and focus in particular on the issues of conversion narratives and the Pentecostalization of religion in general in the region of Central America and Latin America. The books and the presentations complement each other in multiple ways. And although you guys use similar methodology, interviewing ex-gang members, the differences in perspective of an anthropologist and a sociologist really complement each other nicely. Focusing on questions of space and identity and reframing the way we think about gang members, how they enter and leave gangs, imaginative rationality, to borrow a term from Dave Smiley, how people reconceptualize their lives. And for reasons you both highlight, it's difficult, very difficult, for personal safety reasons and because most universities won't let you go out and do this kind of research, to interview current gang members. So it tends to be ex-gang members, and many of them tend to be Pentecostal. So I want to talk a little bit about how that influences the way we interpret the results and ask you guys some questions about that. And I don't want to repeat what the two of you have already talked about. Time is brief, and we like to give some chance to the audience. So just want to hit the high points. Violence, first, is endemic. It's connected to transnational factors far beyond local control. And the young men and women use a variety of tools for dealing with that at the local level where you're doing your research. You can join Maras, you can join Padillas, you can leave them, you can join Pentecostal churches, you can work through Catholic organizations, you can migrate, which may be the best way out possible, physically extricating yourself from the location. So that's one point. The second is, and Bob, you call the organizations greedy institutions, right? Pentecostal organizations. In other words, they're also omnivorous in their demands for new members, as are gangs. And the interesting thing about that is that what they provide, and you just heard a little bit about it, is the accountability of a small congregation with strict behavioral guidelines, and the emphasis on the domestic sphere. So gang members get social capital, right? They can get jobs, as we just heard about, but they also get spiritual capital. They get a set of practices, beliefs, and rituals that can keep them from going back into the gang. And the third is, and both authors actually didn't talk much about it today, but they both also focus on the Catholic churches that have tended to found programs invested in preventing gang violence in the first place. So youth intervention programs and other kind of programs that get people before they wind up in a Mara. So those are all, I think, important things for policy, and something, Bob, you elaborated a little bit, and obviously we just heard about how those things can impact policy, particularly when we know that most of the Central American Regional Security Initiative is not going to civil society organizations at all, that civil society organizations are one of the places where this money should be going. And Pastor Alvarado just talked about Trabajemos por la Paz, and there are others as well. But one thing that really struck me in both the books and the interviews is that the interviews take the form of a Pentecostal ritual, kind of the practiced art of the conversion narrative. In other words, because you're largely limited to interviewing ex-gang members, there's a very familiar format to what they have to say, and that narrative allows people to do two things, very important things. The first one is to hit a reset button, right? Basically to say, okay, we can reinterpret life events now in the context of a current Pentecostal worldview. So everything doesn't change. The violence is still there. It still exists. Narco-trafficking is still there. Poverty is still there. Family disintegration is still there. But because you have changed, because you've hit the reset button, you can now interpret those things in a different way. And the second thing it does is that it allows those things to be interpreted in a manner that is external. In a sense, there are larger forces at play, and those larger forces are the forces of demons and good, of evil and good, and those forces explain both what happened in the past and what's happening in the present, and that allows someone to hit that reset button and move forward from there. So to tell a story of why you left the gang, or joined the gang for that matter, is very much like the story that the alcoholic tells of why they stopped drinking, of the spousal abuser who stopped doing that and joined the Pentecostal church. I mean, for those of us who study religion and politics, it's a very common and consistent narrative. And it's very ritualized, and as you point out in the books, emotionalized. And I think the telling thing is some of the examples of the stories that people told about joining the gangs, and the stories also of how they left them, all interpreted through the same lens. I'll give you some eerie similarities in those. And you talked about them a little bit, John. In each case, the young person's overcome with shame. It could be their history, their background, whatever else it is. but they transcend it by belonging to something larger, either the gang or the church. In each case, you're baptized in a highly emotional break with the past. You're literally beaten into the gang, and you literally cry your way into your conversion experience. In each case, you're actively proselytized. I mean, one with guns, the other with guitars, but in both cases, you're getting asked to join. In each case, the commitment curve is extremely steep and involves complete loyalty. You cannot do both. In each case, charismatic individuals with magnetic personalities become the leaders. In fact, many ex-gang members are now leaders in Pentecostal communities. And each I guess this is my real point, is that each process is really a career. And this is what I really like about these books in particular, is they study, because they were long-term, because they were ethnographic interviews, you're studying the careers of people over time. And you know some of these individuals and where they've wound up and where they continue to wind up. And I think that's the same thing, it's the same point that we've made in the study of religion and politics for a long time, is that the process of conversion is not a single one-time event. It's an ongoing process that happens over time. And Bob, you noted some of the informants actually had Pentecostal parents before they joined the gang. So this narrative may well have been familiar to them even before they got in gang life and joined a Pentecostal church and got out of gang life. You also note that in studies of the U.S., current gang members sometimes have standardized answers about inquiries to gang life, and I'd say probably it's similar with the Pentecostals. There's some standardized answers to these questions that filter through. And that brings me to my first question. I mean, both of you note that ex-gang members are acutely aware of social cleansing. You talked about social cleansing, and you both take pains to point out that many of them fall victim to it. And that leads me to wonder, what do Pentecostal ex-gangbangers, how do they grapple with those messages of social cleansing that are frequently repeated in particularly the big neo-Pentecostal churches, where social cleansing is talked about sometimes as a form of divine justice. I've heard sermons by pastors in Guatemala about this. And you have to wonder, how do these gang members kind of grapple with those kinds of messages? Obviously, the institutional Catholic Church in Central America has come out directly and taken a position against social cleansing. Pentecostal churches have no central organization to speak for them, so different pastors say different things at different times. But in general, a lot of the big ones at the big neo-Pentecostal churches have at least looked the other way, if not openly embraced it in some cases. Another question that occurs to me is why gang leaders, in particular the kingpins, who have a vested interest, allow people to leave. I understand why your local barrio homeboy might say and respect the Pentecostal exit strategy, right? But why would somebody who actually has a vested interest in making sure that one of his or her lieutenants doesn't get out, particularly if they join a church that then promotes social cleansing and brings that information with them into that church? So is the exit only good for lower level gang members, or does it also work for people who are higher up? A final question relates to networks and agency. You each take pains to point out the agency of the individual young people who are moving through this process. And I think you each touch on a little bit, but could expand some on the networks, right? The nodes of the networks, family, and other local networks that drive people toward or away from the gangs. And I think that's particularly where the Catholic Church is doing a lot of work. So to wrap up, I want to come back to the idea of Pentecostalization. What I mean by that is the acceptance of religious beliefs, millennialism, to some degree biblical literalism, the experiences of pneumatic religious practices, speaking in tongues, divine healing, this conversion process that you've been talking about. And I think really that's the real shift in religious practice in general in the region, that it's going on across Protestant, Catholic, even Mormon you're seeing Pentecostalization of religion and society. And why do I keep coming back to this? Not just because I wrote a book about it a long time ago, but because I think it is an important thing, because it breaks down some of the categories of analysis that we tend to fall back into. Oh, let's compare Protestants and Catholics. Well, that comparison in many ways is not the most salient one, and I think both of you are well aware of that. Second, it leads to more refined models that take into account the interactions between Pentecostalized religion and the contextual opportunity structure that people have. And those kind of models are similar to the ones you guys have presented to us, and I think they really are the future of research on religion and politics, not just religion and violence, but religion and politics in the region. Gang violence and other issues actually point to potential coalitions where ecumenical work can be done with Catholic and Pentecostal organizations, and I think this is one. You both hinted at that. Third, Pentecostalized religion is certainly political, but it's not political in the ways that we generally assume. Right, left, those kinds of things. It's political in the sense that it generates grievances for people, it informs their public discourse, it interacts with other identities, and it mobilizes opinions around day-to-day life issues that matter to people, like violence. And you guys are exploring exactly that. So I think that research is your research is an outstanding example of how that can be put in place. And finally, I just want to put in a plug, again, for more careful attention to the process and meaning of conversion narratives. This is in part because although we treat it as static, the process of conversion unfolds over time. It's dynamic, it changes, and it demonstrates an ongoing process of continuity and rupture with the former life of many converts. When you read the stories, you could hear gang members with some degree still of pride talking about former gang activities, despite the fact that they're not really engaged in them anymore. So the past is alive. I mean, the thing about the Pentecostal worldview is it keeps the demons alive. They're there. They don't go away. They're part of everyday life. It's just a different way of dealing with them. So as I was reading your interviews, I couldn't help but read them as testimonies, the telling and retelling and joining of and leaving gangs in a manner that both provides agency to the teller, but also attributes the worst of their behavior and other behaviors to powers that are far beyond their control. And in a region with, massive public corruption, rampant arms and narco-trafficking, post-war trauma, hyper-globalization, you can hardly blame a 16-year-old for pursuing exactly that type of narrative, particularly somebody who probably has little to no chance to make it to 30. So thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Tim, thank you. Alex?
Cindy, I've sat in your chair, and I know you're watching your watch and thinking about this group of people out here who have undoubtedly a great many interesting things to say and important questions to ask, so I will try to be brief. And I'm going to try to step back slightly from this because we've heard people who have spoken in great depth, I think, and with both enormous expertise and also with unmistakably, I think, real emotion. It's very unusual in Washington to have an event like this where significant issues are illuminated by rigorous analysis and sound evidence. It is rare. But to have that compared also with the fact that we are getting to human realities here in individual lives, ultimate matters, life and death. That is what religion brings into this discussion, because that is what religion ultimately deals with. And whether it's Christianity or other religions, whether it's Catholicism or evangelical churches, or through the wide variety of these things, these are ultimate questions, and it reminds us of what's at stake. And you could hear that in every one of these presentations if you listened. You definitely can hear it because, for example, to take our two young researchers from Central America, these guys have clearly been deeply engaged with these subjects of theirs. Now, who are these subjects? And again, Pastor Josue puts his finger right on it, as each Bob and John both did as well, which is, these are the worst of the worst. These are los perdidos. These guys are bestias, right? And that is where the church has gone. And that's an extraordinary thing. I mean, that's not the kind of thing you're going to hear very often in a policy seminar. It's a depth, it's a level, it's way past metrics, it's way past abstract conceptions. It gets to it touches us in a different place, I think, than just here. And that's extremely important. And you understand that very well, Pastor. Sin duda. I think what this reminds me of is something that has engaged me personally for a very long time, which is the human rights movement. And the human rights movement in Latin America, as I think all of us in this room know, was very distinctively influenced by the churches, and particularly probably at the time the Catholic Church. And one of the questions that I thought about here as I read actually their work, as I watched the video and listened to Pastor, is, are these gang members considered victims? In human rights, right, the human rights perspective is distinctive and important because it is based on taking the perspective of the victims. It is about representing the victims of violence. Now, we know that the violence of the past, when the human rights movement came together, the 1970s, the 1980s, right? That violence was different. It was political violence. That's when your family left, for example. And that is very understandable. It was insurgency and, for the most part, even worse, counterinsurgency. And not only in Central America, but in South America as well. Okay, so, but that was a different violence. Now we think, well, the violence is criminal violence. And we can understand it in religious terms as being committed by people who are sinners. And if we're religious, we say we're all sinners. But some of these sinners are doing terrible things. And we can understand it that way. But what I hear here is a way of getting to what I think the human rights movement always understood, which is that there are victims of violence, okay? And that is who the human rights movement tried to defend and protect. Now, the situation in Latin America, is it a human rights problem today in Latin America? Is crime a human rights problem? I see a few people here from organizations here in Washington that believe that it is a human rights problem, but it is not perceived as a human rights problem. Because, for the most part, we could say the people responsible for this violence are not representatives of the state. They're not agents of the state. We could debate that one, by the way. We could debate it in any one of the Central American countries. We could debate it in Mexico. We know that there are a tremendous number of old-fashioned political human rights violations occurring by state agents, whether they're the police, whether they're the army, and so forth. And there are a lot of countries like that, and Central America is very represented. But let's leave that on the side. The question is, who are the victims? Now, what we've heard here is a very unusual focus, which is a focus on the fact that the people who have committed violence in the past are victims themselves. That's an extraordinary position. And it is, I think it's a deeply Christian position, but it is a very, very unusual position to take. My question to that, I guess, is one, is that how the people who have looked into this question and who have been involved with it personally, do they see them as victims as well as sinners? And then what about the people who were the victims of these gang members and the other gang members? The innocent people, the community members. Okay. One of the interesting themes that emerged here in the discussion was this idea that the community is here and the world is there. I'd love to hear some more discussion about that. What about when a member of the community, of our church, right, of our little tight group, whether it's Catholic or evangelical, what about if they are killed by gang members? What is the reaction? They're victims in a different way than the gang members themselves, surely. And surely there's a tension over things like this. And what about the people who are killed who are not members of those little communities? Are they victims? Should the church be concerned with them too? Right? I think those are extremely important and interesting questions. The other one I was going to ask was the one you raised, Tim, which is, I think, why is it that the gangs respect this exception, this idea that conversion, why don't they punish these guys? What is it that motivates them? And I know that's hard to ask because you can't get at what the gang members really think. I mean, obviously from an evidentiary point of view, that's a difficult research question. Anyway, I think these are absolutely superb. I mean, this was just wonderful presentations, terrific comments by Tim, and I look forward to a larger discussion.
Great. Thank you all to our panelists. We do have some time for questions. We'd ask you to please wait for the microphone and also to identify yourself by name and by the institution for which you work. We'll take a couple of questions and then come back to our panelists. Since the microphones are back, I'm going to call on you, but I want to start in the back where the microphones are. I see Chris Ash, Department of State.
Hi, thanks for the presentations. I was in Honduras 3 weeks ago for a week, and we actually, one thing to clarify, in CARSI, we are spending tens of millions of dollars per year through AID on community engagement. We think what's critical is what you've identified, which is most of the crime prevention, the identification of the root causes of crime have to be community-based, and we're doing a lot of work there. We're actually stepping that up. We're increasing the funding. So that's critical to a solution. One of the questions I do have, though, how successful can these efforts be lacking a government presence in these communities? It's in many ways unfair to have these small churches. We fund small churches on outreach centers, and they have a tough time coming up with a couple of $100s per month to sustain our efforts when we have a transition period. So are the governments themselves committed to working with the Pentecostal movement, with the churches, to try to actually support what they're doing? Because lacking opportunity for education, for employment, you're taking people off the street from a gang, but there's no next step for them, and it's not something that's sustainable or, I think, long-term provides the opportunities to keep them out of crime. People have to feed their families at the end of the day, and they have to have opportunity, or they'll come north, or they'll go back to a different type of crime.
Yes, thanks. Anyone else in the back? Sure.
I'm Rosa Alonso, work at the World Bank. Thank you very much for fantastic presentations on such an important topic. You mentioned at the beginning, Robert, the problem of that a lot of these people in gang members, that are gang members, are people who have been totally despised. And you mentioned the element of shame as well. And it's very different, the element of shame. You can be ashamed because you've committed crimes, but why were you ashamed to start with? Who made you ashamed? Were you ashamed that you were poor? Were you ashamed that you looked different from the elites? And I wanted to ask you, because also some of this, I wanted to ask to which extent it has a dimension that's really very strongly, like I think you intimated, that's social and class. Take the 1932 killing of so many indigenous people in El Salvador. They were communists, but they were indigenous. It was an excuse also to kill the indigenous people. Just like in Argentina and Chile during the military dictatorships, if you were socialist and Jewish, you had more of a chance to be desaparecido. To which extent is this also a way of continuing social and ethnic discrimination? And is there anything that's being done to change these attitudes of the elites? Because so many, I think, of the problems of the regions come from those attitudes. I work on the Philippines, and all of this doesn't exist despite huge income inequality. Africa, there's a lot of lack of opportunity and all sorts of things, but you don't have this because there isn't, I think, these kinds of dimensions. So I'd be very interested in your views.
Take one more here. Katie, down at this end, thanks.
Faizan Illich, Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Two questions. One, to what extent is this problem a legacy of the civil wars, and what would be the implications if that's the case? The second point is there is a fantastic study of gangs in Chicago in the projects that came out as a book called One Day as a Gang Leader for a Day. And this guy gets very close to these people. He almost moves in with them. And what you can see is really that these gangs particularly are just like a corporation. And the gang leader is really like a CEO. And many of the skills are actually transferable if you change the product and you took out the violence out of this. To what extent a similar comparison may be valid?
We'll take one last question for this round here on the side.
Hi, my name is James Patton. I'm with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. In a former life, I ran the Quaker peacemaking for the Andes, including working in urban areas with gangs. So, hago mis comentarios en español porque principalmente quiero dirigirlo al doctor Alvarado. Obviamente, un gran parte de esto de que la gente se incluya en estas pandillas es que se sienten excluidos de los mecanismos formales de la sociedad, ¿cierto? Esa es forma de buscar identidad. Entonces, mi pregunta es, hablamos mucho del papel de la iglesia en transformar estos individuos, en sentir otro concepto de ser. Pero lo que no estamos diciendo es cuál es el papel de la iglesia en hablar con la sociedad, los que sí tienen poder, los que sí tienen recursos, en cambiar su perspectiva, en cómo se puede aplicar sus recursos y sus capacidades a transformar este sentido de incluirse estos individuos en la sociedad como parte de los mecanismos que está funcionando como identidad social entero, ¿cierto? Porque en mi experiencia, esa gente, el problema es que trabajan con los pobres, pero no los más pobres de los pobres, porque hasta ahí no creen que pueden tener un impacto que tiene beneficio para ellos mismos. Entonces, hay un papel espiritual en este, digamos, el hueco entre estos dos grupos también.
Let me just ask a question. How many people in the room, do we have a translator? Yes, in the back. And are people who don't understand Spanish able to access the translation? I just want to make sure that that is the case before we turn back to Padre Josue. Yeah, everybody's
Should I
good?
do it quickly in English as well?
I think we're okay as long as those who need translation are able to access it. Thank you. Josue.
Estamos considerando y se está haciendo actividades a niveles de pastores, líderes de iglesias, donde estamos presentando el problema y concientizando, porque definitivamente nos encontramos nosotros con los mismos muchachos que dicen que ellos han llegado a las iglesias, ellos han llegado tal vez a tocar puertas, pero no quieren nada, porque primero por el temor y todo eso, y no le cierran puertas. Entonces ese trabajo lo estamos haciendo a nivel de iglesias, donde estamos haciendo seminarios, algunos retiros, donde estamos concientizando a los pastores que den espacio, y también hemos hecho actividades con la empresa privada. Estamos también haciendo reuniones donde está la empresa privada y tenemos también ministros de iglesias, y les decimos de la necesidad que hay de acercarse y dar espacio para esta gente para resolver el problema que tenemos.
Just go down the line here and have people respond to the various issues that have been put on the table.
Okay, there's a lot here. Where to start? Okay, I'll try to do a couple that I might do briefly. One is the question about the connection to the Civil War. I have no doubt that the Civil Wars open, I guess they're called armed internal conflict. In Guatemala, they're now using that term more than guerra civil. It still killed hundreds of thousands. But I have no doubt that the armed conflicts in Guatemala and El Salvador and the sort of armed disappearances in Honduras helped to set the stage for we're among the contributing factors in the gang violence. I don't think you can draw a very obvious and clear line between one and the other, though, because it seems to me that if that were the case, if the civil wars or internal conflicts, whatever you want to call them, were the most important factor in laying the groundwork for the emergence of transnational gangs in Central America, then we would see more gang violence in Nicaragua and less gang violence in Honduras. And we don't. We see Honduras as having, by some reports, some of the highest levels of gang participation. And Nicaragua really, as far as I know, doesn't have very strong transnational gang presence in it. And that has more to do with migration patterns. The fact that Nicaraguans tend to migrate to Miami and Costa Rica and not to Los Angeles and DC and Chicago. That's my take, that there, certainly by disrupting social networks, by disrupting the government's ability to be a service provider in communities, the wars set the stage, to a certain degree preparing the way for the practice of violence and spreading weapons. But I wouldn't want to put too much on the civil wars for those reasons. And Venkatesh's work on gangs, very interesting, very provocative, very highly readable, there and useful in some ways for his sociological perspective. Interestingly, he's starting to get some criticism for it. I really like a new book by Victor Rios, California ex-gang member who's now a sociologist at the UC Santa Barbara, who has written a book about his dissertation on working with gang youth in Oakland. And he's pretty critical of Venkatesh, and Venkatesh's, what he says is kind of a Jungle Book narrative of, I went in, I experienced everything that gang members did, and I came out and lived to tell the story of it. Whether you buy that critique or not, it's interesting that he, Rios has a different story about how capable and organized gang youth are for getting, as business people. But certainly that they engage in business practices, for sure. And I compare them, the Central American gangs, to franchises, in part because of their business practices, but more because of their loose kind of organizational network. They're not a perfect top-down, well-maintained hierarchy like an army. They're just not. They're more loosely organized like a franchise. Where does shame come from? It comes from growing up poor, in a poor neighborhood, where darker-skinned Central Americans live. And I think racism is a part of this. Racism and classism are hard to pull apart in Central America, very hard to pull apart. But also from the experience of family abuse and abandonment. So I think what some scholars have called the feminization of migration is an important factor in this, largely because Northern Central American countries, Mesoamerica, is still a society that venerates motherhood, deeply venerates motherhood. And when mom leaves, even if it's to go and be a better provider from afar by sending resources, by going and taking care of other people's children and other people's elders here in the United States, addressing the care gap in the United States, they are essentially saying, or that message has been interpreted in the lives of many of the ex-gang members I interviewed, that message was interpreted as, my mother, even my own mother, wouldn't stay with me. That sense of shame is really deep, and it was palpable in the interviews. So I think the feminization of migration has a lot to do with it. Not just disrupted family networks, but the fact that mom is gone is serious. And then, poverty, racism, classism, we know about those. I better limit my comments to that.
John?
Sure. I'd like to briefly address the first question, if I could. In many of the neighborhoods and the communities that I worked in, the only presence of the state, per se, was through police and military force that were policing the neighborhoods. In El Progreso, there is a lack of, like many other places in Honduras, a lack of police presence that was beneficial. When a police force is corrupt, and there's a lot of when the judicial system is corrupt, people don't feel like they can turn to state forms of justice. And we could go back and forth. I think there's there is a great deal at risk when any state starts to cede its moral and social responsibility to private funded organizations. I think there's a certain role for having a social safety net that works. And there are things that NGOs can do really well. There are things that CBOs can do really well. The community-based organizations can do really well. But that needs to happen in partnership with a state-backed organizations that are also willing to do the work. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that will as existing. Especially there is the sense that the poor are on their own. And that's lamentable. And I don't think there's going to be any real solution to these severe forms of marginalization until that gets addressed. And how do we address it? Partly by helping national governments to spend more money on social programming to eliminate some of the forms of bribery and corruption, eliminate the foreign debt in many of these countries. I think there's some macro level things that can happen, but just focusing primarily on community-based organizations and is in many ways a band-aid to a larger issue. I'd kind of like to address Tim's question if I could, because you got me thinking about, and Alex as well, about what happens with victims, right? Are all victims the same? And one of the most disheartening things that I saw in the communities that I worked in is that for young men who are murdered on the street, when that happens, their reputation is already cast into doubt. There is no such thing as an innocent victim. If you are a victim, that means you did something wrong. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you wore your hair the wrong way, you dressed in a particularly provocative way, and something about your individual behavior is what marked you out for being a victim of gang violence or a victim of police violence. And that is, part of that is tied into this idea that if you do not separate yourself from the cultural way of being that is part of being a gang member, which, by the way, is also wrapped up into transnational media images of what's hip and cool, and that's kind of a problem. Then if you don't distance yourself from that image, then you yourself are partly to blame for your outcome, for what happens.
Alex.
Could I just follow up a little bit, because I think Chris Asher's raised an extremely critical question here, this question of what it is that the United States should support. And it also comes back to a comment Tim made. I mean, so much of our aid is for military purposes and for kind of hard solutions in many ways. And I think there is a sort of intermediate stage between social programs that John has referred to and the kinds of basic reforms of institutions, of the justice system, the courts, the police, and so forth, that the United States could potentially be helpful with. The only way, though, that the United States, I think, can really help with that kind of stuff, and this is a lesson that I think comes out of the human rights movement, is if United States aid is actually guided by human rights principles. Because if it is not, it will simply end up being wasted at best and perhaps reinforcing a pattern and a cycle of violence there. I think the idea of, it makes a difference whether the United States actually has a policy that supports human rights or simply a rhetorical policy of human rights.
Alex, if I could just add to that, I mean, I think one of the critical components that comes out of what you're saying, but sort of in verse, is the necessity for local leadership. And, the United States government funding cannot support,
right.
Human rights criteria if there aren't people on the receiving end who are willing to undertake the kinds of reforms that would embrace that those kinds of values and model. I think we have time for one more round. We'll start here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Luis Cardona, and I'm a part of a ad hoc group called the Transnational Group in support of the current peace process in El Salvador. And so I have two questions. The first one, I would like to hear everyone's take on the first question, and that is, what's your perspective on the current, I won't call it a truce, but the peace process that's going on in El Salvador? And I'd be interested to hear that. I also, to Alex, I would recommend a real nice story that was done about 2 weeks ago in Color Lines, and they talked about this group that I just identified with, and the importance of reconciliation that goes way beyond just the religious experience or just the experience of the homeboys, but also looks at the perspective of the victims, the people in the communities that have been impacted by so many years of violence. And then the third piece is going back to the first question, right? If indeed this is a legitimate process that we're experiencing in El Salvador right now, can it be sustained without the support of the government in El Salvador as well as other governments, not just the United States, but other governments around the world? And I would include any other investment group, World Bank, IDB.
In the back here, did I see Luis? No? Sure, right over here.
All right, thank you all for your presentations. I'm interning with the OAS for the summer in the Department of Public Security, working on initiatives to stem the illicit trade and manufacture of small arms and light weapons in the Americas specifically. So the two trends that I see going on in the war on drugs in Mexico is that large drug cartels are moving south into Guatemala and the Petén region and establishing, setting up bases there and recruiting more gang members through cartels and so forth. And also that the president of Guatemala, Otto Pérez Molina, has talked about the legalization of drugs in Guatemala. So what does this mean for gang members? Is this enabling them to do their job, or is this, an entrepreneurial initiative to try to stem the gang violence in Latin America? Thanks.
Okay. Perhaps one more if there is. If not, we'll, sure.
Thank you. But I prefer in Spanish because my English is bad. Okay? Yo soy el agregado militar en la Embajada de Guatemala, general del Ejército. A través del tiempo hemos visto cómo los gobiernos han hecho lo posible y hasta lo imposible por combatir esos flagelos que acechan a la sociedad. Las pandillas, las maras, definitivamente, como han dicho, sectores que se han visto un poco despreciados, pero sinceramente las pandillas es el vivero para después convertir al personal en otro ente, a otro nivel de delincuencia, como por ejemplo al crimen organizado, al narcotráfico y a todo lo que se puede decir que afecta, en este caso, el tema que está hablando es Centroamérica. Muy bien. Cuando habla el señor Alvarado Pastor acerca de la participación de la iglesia, de la religión, yo estoy muy consciente y he visto cómo se han agotado los recursos. Y cuando la iglesia ha entrado en ese campo, yo creo y he visto que Dios sí ha transformado los corazones de ese personal. Cuando Dios toca el corazón de un pandillero, ahí hay cambio permanente. Cuando se tocan programas de diferente tipo social, van a ser consecuentes a un tiempo, a un periodo. Pero cuando Dios transforma el corazón, no solo del pandillero, del narcotraficante y del narcoterrorista, ahí hay cambio verdadero y permanece. Entonces, creería de que su programa, señor Jorge Alvarado, ¿qué podemos también nosotros hacer para apoyarle? En Guatemala hemos visto muy de cerca, y tal como el video y algunas otras presentaciones, hemos visto que a través de que hayan programas certeros en la iglesia y que verdaderamente Dios entre al corazón, ahí hay cambio de esa población. Hasta el día de hoy, la familia sigue siendo la base fundamental de la sociedad. Y si hay una familia desintegrada, corroída, afectada, va a haber una sociedad afectada y corroída.
Thank you. Why don't we ask Pastor Josue, and then we'll start with Alex in reverse order for a final round of comments.
Sí, nosotros estamos definitivamente el proyecto que se ha comenzado en El Salvador, ya se está hablando con pastores de Guatemala, de Honduras. Esperamos que ya consolidado, ya con un poco más de tiempo de madurez de lo que estamos haciendo, va a pasar a Honduras, Guatemala y esperamos estar juntos para trabajar en este flagelo que está castigando nuestra tierra, nuestros países.
And then a final round of comments from the panel, starting with Alex, if he'd like. Not obligatory, but if you, in reverse order.
It's a privilege to hear this extremely good research, to have such good commentary on it, and let's hope that it can be heard a little bit more in Washington. This is terribly, terribly important. I would return, I guess, to the very first point that Bob Brenaman made, which is that the gang problem, which is important without any doubt, is only a small part, actually, of the large problem of violence in the region. The problem of violence is much, much larger, and it's been good to focus on this part of it today, but we also need to look at the larger.
Tim, final word?
Just to respond to the young man from the OAS, I mean, I think your question also answered itself in the sense that, yes, no question, the Zetas moving into the Petén, the fact that Guatemala is such a transshipment point. I mean, I know flights come into the Rio Dulce, they pay people to literally dismantle the plane and to put it on a boat and drop it back out in the ocean because the plane is worth nothing relative to what it's moving. So throughout, the whole zone, the traffic zone through Honduras into Guatemala, into the Petén, into Mexico is beyond state control at this point. So no question that, and the president talking about legalization, I think, is sort of a last resort, at least putting on the international agenda. We know how far that's going to go, but at least it's on the agenda.
I'd like to comment briefly on the first question, and this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I kind of want to withhold judgment at this point to see what happens. I think it's still too soon to know what might come of this. I'm a little suspicious, mostly because I'm pessimistic by nature, but I think there is an opportunity for the Catholic Church in particular throughout the region to invest more in creating conflict resolution trainings to help sort of work at the local level about how to deal with these interpersonal issues in a way that doesn't resort to not just gun violence and armed violence, but also fights. I mean, that's, it's an escalation that can take a fist fight into a cycle of revenge. And I think that there's an opportunity there that should be explored more.
Okay, these are great questions. Wow, we could spend a lot of time developing them. I'm going to try to take these last three quickly. And I'll say, since John mentioned the Salvadoran peace process, whoa, this caught me totally by surprise. The idea that a military chaplain, a Catholic military chaplain, And excuse me, former FMLN individual, former politician, also businessman, would go in and with kind of the blessing of the government, at least as they say, but not the necessarily intervention of the government, go into the prison and negotiate a kind of truce between the two major gangs. Not in a million years would I have predicted that something like that would happen. Now, my first reaction was skepticism too. Something's going on here, and somebody's paying off somebody. I don't know. But the more I read about it, while I was keeping up, now I haven't been reading for the last month the papers, but while I was keeping up, I was won over at least to a sort of very moderated optimism, hopefulness that, hey, this might be a good thing. And I don't care if it wasn't the archbishop that negotiated the truce or whatever. If he's not the ungido, it doesn't matter to me if he's not the anointed one. It was a chaplain, a military chaplain. Who cares if they found a way to trust each other enough? And I'm not disappointed either that the government allowed them to be transferred to another prison. Hey, if it works, let's do it. I'm hopeful, but I know that and then there's also the critique that they're not promising not to extort anymore. Okay, true, but take it one step at a time. Let's see how it unfolds. And what we really do need is a foothold to be able to sort of carve out spaces of safety and increased trust to build so that governments can play a more formal role in providing security. So that's my take on that. Second. To address the issue of the military attaché to Guatemala, that the government han hecho lo posible. Okay, that's true. Maybe, perhaps the government has done lo posible. In Guatemala in particular, they haven't taken quite as punitive an approach as in Honduras and Salvador, which I think is damaging. Nevertheless, you can't do much when you're only collecting 11% of the GDP in taxes. You really can't do much. I'll say, sure, corruption is a part of this, and it needs to be dealt with and everything. But when your budget is this small for a country that really does have resources, really does have industry, but it's not collecting that, and it does not have a robust government, you're going to be hard pressed to make a real impact in providing public security. So there's got to be this national debate. We're setting a bad example in the United States, in my opinion, right now, of how we're taxing and how we're discussing taxes. But nevertheless, I think that has to be one of the policy issues. You've got to collect more, and you've got to collect more from elites. I really think that has to be part of it. The tax system is regressive in Guatemala, especially. And finally, Molino Perez's his throwing his support behind legalization, the discussion of legalization. Hey, I welcome that. I said that's a great idea. I mean, not a great idea, but I think it's good that we're seeing some of this be thrown out, to be put on the table. Now, I'm not of the opinion that legalizing drugs would do away with all violence in Central America. I also know that it would bring new unintended consequences, certainly. But the status quo is unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and we've been doing it too long. It's not providing a real change. I think legalization has to be on the table, and I applaud Molino Perez. And once again, it caught me completely by surprise. I wasn't expecting it, but hey, that's great. It's not. We don't always have to be pessimists, I don't think. And the Wilson Center and the ICG have done good reports on this, on the problem of violence and drugs and gangs in Central America. Read them, and you'll be hard pressed to continue to support just the same old status quo approaches to this, I think.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, but I'd like to just echo Alex's comment earlier that it's rare in the Wilson Center and in Washington and generally that we combine the sort of view from 30,000 feet, the macro policy approach, with something so deeply personal and spiritual that affects human lives one by one. I want to thank Padre or Pastor Alvarado for the extraordinary work that he's been doing in Salvadoran communities, and thank all of you who have really devoted your lives to understanding and working on these issues and keeping them and that perspective, at the center of our policy concerns. Please join me in a round of applause and thanks for our panelists.